Just as warmth flickered at the edge of his memory, a shadow fell over it. Her next words slicing through the air. And his inheritance? When can we access it if he's incapacitated? Panic surged despite his feeble state. Pretending to slip deeper into his coma, Daniel seized what little power he had to remain unnoticed for now. He's awake but trapped, facing a sinister betrayal he never saw coming. Stay with us if you want to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. The first sensation was pain, a dull, throbbing ache that pulsed from somewhere deep in Daniel Mercer's skull. It wasn't sharp or localized, but rather a full, cosmic pressure, as if his brain had swollen to press against every millimeter of his cranium. Before consciousness, before memory, before identity, there was this pain, existence being. Daniel didn't know he was Daniel yet. He existed in a twilight state, aware enough to feel discomfort, but not cognizant enough to understand what it meant. The darkness was total, not because the room was dark, but because his eyelids were too heavy to lift. The weight of them seemed impossible, as if they'd been sewn shut or covered with coins like a corpse in some ancient burial ritual. Sound came next. At first, just a distant murmuring, like waves breaking on a shoreline miles away. Then slowly, the auditory fog began to lift. Beeping, rhythmic and electronic. A hissing noise that cycled every few seconds. The squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. These sounds assembled themselves into meaning. Hospital. He was in a hospital. Why? The question formed, but answers didn't follow. His mind was a jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing. The voices grew clearer. A woman. Her tone was hushed, but the acoustics of the room, likely small, with hard surfaces, carried her words to him with surprising clarity. "It's been 8 weeks, Dr. Levin. I need to know what to expect." Her voice was familiar, intimate even, but he couldn't place it. Something about it made his stomach tighten, though he couldn't understand why. A deeper voice responded. "Male. Professional. Mrs. Mercer, your husband's condition remains stable, but unchanged. The brain trauma was significant. These cases are difficult to predict. Mrs. Mercer, his wife. Caroline." The name surfaced from a murk of his scattered thoughts. Caroline Mercer. His wife of how many years? 12? 15? The number wouldn't come. But what are his chances of recovery? Really? Caroline's voice had an edge to it that Daniel found disconcerting. It was a concern he heard, but something else. Impatience? As I've explained, the longer a patient remains in a vegetative state, the lower the likelihood of full recovery. However, there are cases where patients awaken after months or even years, though often with significant cognitive impairment. And if he doesn't wake up, what then? Then we'd eventually have to discuss long-term care options. But we're not there yet, Mrs. Mercer. A silence followed, broken only by the steady beeping of what Daniel now recognized as a heart monitor. His heart monitor. The realization was startling. He was the patient. He was in a coma, or had been. He was waking up now, wasn't he? But his body remained unresponsive, a prison of flesh that ignored his will. "I should go make some calls," Caroline said finally. "Thank you, doctor." Footsteps receded. A door opened and closed. Daniel assumed he was alone, but then heard the rustle of clothing nearby. Someone else was in the room. "You can drop the act now." Caroline's voice again, but transformed. The professional concern she displayed with the doctor had vanished, replaced by a cold flatness that Daniel had never heard from her before. "He's gone. Thank God." A man's voice. "Young. Bagli familiar. I hate that guy. So fucking condescending. We need to be patient, Jason. Another month, maybe 2, and then we can start pushing for decisions to be made." Jason. The name triggered a cascade of memories. Jason Thorne, Caroline's personal trainer. 29 years old, 15 years younger than Caroline, 20 years younger than Daniel. Built like a magazine cover model, with the intellectual depth of a puddle. Daniel had never liked him, had made jokes about Caroline's midlife crisis workout phase. When had it become more than training sessions? "I don't get why we have to wait," Jason said. "He's basically gone already." The doctor said so. No, he said recovery becomes less likely over time. That's not the same thing. Caroline sounded irritated. We need to be careful. His family already doesn't trust me. If we push too hard too soon, they'll fight it. Fight what? You're his wife. Don't you automatically get everything? A laugh from Caroline, short and humorless. God, you're naive. It's not that simple. Yes, I'll get the house and our joint assets, but the business is complicated. He put most of it in a trust, and there are conditions. If he's permanently incapacitated, decisions need to be made by a committee, me, his brother Michael, and the company CFO, Diane. So what? 2 against 1. You and Diane can outvote the brother. Diane is loyal to Daniel. She'll side with Michael. They'll want to keep the company running according to Daniel's grand vision. The way she said grand vision dripped with contempt. They don't understand that the real value is in the assets, not the operation. The patents alone are worth millions if we sell to the right buyer. Daniel felt a cold weight settling in his chest. The company, Mercer Biomedical, the medical device firm he'd built from nothing over 20 years, pouring every ounce of his creativity, time, and passion into it. 15 patents, 300 employees, cutting-edge technology that was helping patients around the world. And Caroline wanted to strip it for parts. So what's the plan then? Jason asked. We wait. Let the doctors declare his condition permanent. Then I play the grieving wife who can't bear to watch her husband linger like this. I'll suggest that Daniel wouldn't want extraordinary measures keeping him alive as a vegetable. His brother will fight it, but I'll have public sympathy on my side. And then we pull the plug? Jason's voice held an eagerness that made Daniel's skin crawl. Don't be crass, Caroline snapped. But yes, eventually, and then after a suitable mourning period, I'll have controlling interest in the trust. I can push through the sale of the company, we take the money, and disappear somewhere warm with no extradition treaty. You really think his family will let that happen? They won't have a choice. Legally, I'll be in control. Besides, they can't prove anything. As far as anyone knows, you're just my trainer helping me cope with stress during this difficult time. They both laughed, and Daniel felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with his physical condition. 15 years of marriage. He'd thought he knew her. Caroline, with her sharp intelligence and ambition that had matched his own. Caroline, who'd stood beside him during the lean, early years of the company, who'd hosted dinner parties for potential investors, who'd nursed him through pneumonia 3 years ago. That Caroline had apparently never existed. I should get back to my hotel, Jason said. Same time tomorrow? Yes, but be careful. Michael sometimes drops by in the afternoons. If you see him in the parking lot, just drive past and come back later. More footsteps. Another opening and closing of the door. Then Caroline's sigh, close to Daniel's bed now. He felt her presence looming over him, could smell her perfume, Chanel No. 5, the same scent she'd worn since they met. Once, he'd found it intoxicating. Now it seemed cloying, suffocating. Her fingers brushed his forehead, pushing back a strand of hair. The touch was gentle, almost loving, and all the more horrifying for it. Such a shame, she murmured. You had to go and hit that tree. Couldn't have just died cleanly, could you? Always making things complicated. The accident. Images flashed through Daniel's mind. Rain-slicked roads. Headlights in the darkness. The sudden jerk of the steering wheel. The world spinning. Impact. Darkness. He'd been driving home late from the office. A prototype had failed testing, and he'd stayed to troubleshoot with the engineering team. He'd called Caroline to tell her not to wait up. She'd sounded distracted, dismissive. Was she with Jason then? Caroline's touch withdrew. I'll be back tomorrow, darling. Sleep tight. The door opened and closed once more. Daniel was alone with the beeping monitors and the crushing weight of betrayal. His first instinct was to fight against his paralysis, to force his eyes open, to scream. But a deeper, colder calculation took hold. If he revealed that he was awake, that he had heard everything, what then? In his weakened state, he would be at their mercy. No, better to keep his consciousness hidden, to gather information, to plan. And so Daniel Mercer made the decision that would change everything. He would pretend to remain in his coma. He would become a ghost in his own life, watching and waiting for the moment to reclaim it. The hours passed with excruciating slowness. Nurses came and went, checking his vitals, adjusting his sometimes speaking to him in gentle, encouraging tones that suggested they believed coma patients could hear. They were right, of course, though not in the way they imagined. One of them, a middle-aged woman with a Caribbean accent, hummed as she worked old soul songs that Daniel recognized from his mother's record collection. Her name was Beatrice, he gathered from the conversations around him. He found her presence comforting in a world that had suddenly become hostile and strange. During these long hours of enforced stillness, Daniel's mind began to reassemble itself. Memories returned in fragments, some sharp and clear, others hazy and dreamlike. He remembered his childhood in Buffalo, his parents, both gone now, his father from a heart attack when Daniel was in college, his mother from cancer 5 years ago. He remembered his brother Michael, for years younger, who had worked alongside him at Mercer Biomedical as head of regulatory affairs. Michael, who had apparently been visiting him in the hospital, who Caroline and her lover were conspiring to avoid. And he remembered Caroline, their meeting at a biotech conference in Boston. Her quick mind, her ambition that had seemed to match his own. Their whirlwind courtship and marriage after just 6 months. The early years of building the company together, her as marketing director, him as the inventor and CEO. The gradual distancing as the company grew and demanded more of his time. The arguments about starting a family. He had wanted children, she had always found reasons to wait. The separate vacations in recent years, the separate bedrooms for the past 2. He had attributed it to the natural evolution of a marriage, to 2 busy professionals finding their own space. How blind he had been. Visitors came throughout the day. A doctor, presumably Dr. Levin, checked on him briefly. A physical therapist moved his limbs through a series of exercises to prevent muscle atrophy. And then, in the late afternoon, a new voice. "Hey, big brother. Looking good today." "Well, good might be stretching it, but you've got some color in your cheeks at least." "Michael." Daniel felt a surge of emotion so powerful that he feared it might register on the monitors. His brother's voice was a lifeline to the world he'd lost, to a relationship untainted by betrayal. "The nurses say your vitals are strong. That's something, right? Your body's working. Now we just need your brain to get with the program." Michael's voice cracked slightly on the last words. Daniel heard the scrape of a chair being pulled close to the bed, felt the slight dip of the mattress as Michael leaned on it. "The company's holding up okay. Diane's doing a great job keeping things running. The Neuroflex line is on track for FDA submission next quarter. Everyone sends their love, asks about you every day." A pause. "Caroline's been here a lot. I know you two have had your issues, but she seems really committed to your recovery. It's good to see." The irony was almost too much to bear. Daniel wanted to scream, to grab his brother by the shoulders and tell him everything. But he remained still, focusing on keeping his breathing even, fighting against the betraying flutter of his eyelids. "Mom would have handled this better than me," Michael continued, his voice softer now. "She would have known what to say, how to reach you, wherever you are in there. I'm just trying to keep it together, you know? For you, for the company, for everyone who depends on us." There was a long silence, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor and what sounded suspiciously like Michael sniffling. "Anyway," his brother finally said, voice forcefully brightened, "I brought the latest issue of Tech Innovator. They did that profile on Mercer we've been working on for months. Came out pretty good, all things considered. Thought I'd read it to you. They used that photo from a charity gala last year. You know, the one where you actually combed your hair for once." For the next half hour, Michael read the magazine article aloud, occasionally interrupting himself to add commentary or context. The familiar rhythm of his brother's voice was soothing, even as Daniel's mind raced with the implications of everything he'd learned. The article itself was surreal to hear, a celebration of his life's work, read to him as he lay trapped between death and life, listening to his own eulogy while still breathing. As Michael prepared to leave, promising to return the next day, Daniel made a decision. He needed to communicate with his brother, to warn him. But how? He couldn't simply wake up. His body wasn't ready, and the shock might be dangerous. Besides, if Caroline suspected he'd overheard her plans, she might take more drastic action. No, he needed to be strategic, to find some way to signal Michael without alerting Caroline or the medical staff. That night, after the final nurse's check, Daniel began his first attempts at voluntary movement. He focused all his mental energy on his right index finger, willing it to move. For hours, nothing happened. The connection between his brain and body seemed severed, the neural pathways damaged or dormant. But he persisted, imagining the finger moving, remembering the sensation of flexing it, trying different mental approaches. Just before dawn, when exhaustion had nearly overtaken him, he felt it, the slightest twitch, barely perceptible but real, a spark of hope in the darkness. Over the next 3 days, Daniel established a routine. When nurses or doctors were present, he remained completely passive, allowing them to treat him as the coma patient they believed him to be. When Caroline visited, usually with Jason lurking nearby, he listened carefully to their conversations, gathering information about their plans, fighting to control his rage and disgust. During Michael's visits, he worked on moving his finger, trying to establish a pattern that his brother might notice. 1 twitch for yes, 2 for no, the simplest possible code. But progress was frustratingly slow. The movement remained almost imperceptible, and Michael, though attentive, showed no sign of noticing. On the 4th day, Caroline came alone. Her footsteps were quick and agitated as she entered the room. "Well, your brother is becoming a problem," she announced without preamble. "He's asking questions about the trust, talking to the company lawyers about protecting your interests. As if I'm not your wife, as if I don't have your best interests at heart." She laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that Daniel had never heard from her before. "The irony is, I did love you once. When we met, you were so brilliant, so full of passion and vision. I thought we'd build an empire together." Her voice turned bitter, but then it became all about the work, the precious company, the next innovation. "You disappeared into your lab and your boardroom. I was just furniture, an accessory to the great Daniel Mercer." Daniel felt a twist of guilt amid his anger. There was truth in her words, he knew. He had prioritized the company, had taken her support for granted, had failed to notice when they began to drift apart. It didn't justify her betrayal, her plans to dismantle his life's work, but it complicated the clean narrative of villain and victim he'd been constructing in his mind. "Jason understands me," Caroline continued, her voice softening. "He sees me, not as an extension of something else, but as myself. I know what you'd think, that he's using me, that it's just about money and sex. But you'd be wrong. We have plans, real plans. Not just for the money, but for a life together." She sighed, and he heard her moving around the room. "Anyway, we need to accelerate things. I've scheduled a meeting with your doctors and the hospital ethics committee for next week. I'm going to start the conversation about end-of-life decisions. Michael will fight it, of course, but I've been researching cases like this. The spouse usually prevails, especially when there's no written directive from the patient." Daniel felt cold fear spread through him. A week. He had a week before Caroline began the process that would lead to his death. His efforts at communication suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate. After Caroline left, Daniel redoubled his efforts. He no longer focused solely on his finger, but attempted to move his hand, his arm, his facial muscles, anything that might signal his consciousness. The strain was exhausting, and progress remained minimal. By the time Michael arrived that evening, Daniel was mentally drained but desperately determined. "Rough day at the office," Michael announced as he settled into the chair beside the bed. "The Neuroflex prototype is showing signal degradation in the extended trials. Engineering says it's fixable, but it's going to delay submission." He sighed. Caroline's breathing down everyone's neck about timelines and budgets. "I know she's just trying to keep things on track, but she doesn't understand the technical challenges. That was always your department." As Michael spoke, Daniel concentrated all his remaining energy on his right hand, which lay closest to his brother. "Move, damn it. Move. Oh, and get this. She's called a meeting with your medical team next week. Didn't bother to tell me. I found out from Dr. Levin when I ran into him in the cafeteria. She says it's just a progress update, but something feels off about it. Daniel's finger twitched. Then again, more strongly than before. Michael continued talking, unaware. I don't want to be paranoid, but I've started documenting everything. If she tries to make any decisions about your care without consulting me, I'll... Daniel's entire hand jerked. Michael stopped mid-sentence. Daniel? Did your hand just move? With monumental effort, Daniel moved his finger again. Deliberately. Once. Oh my God. Michael's voice was barely a whisper. Do that again if you can hear me. One twitch. Holy shit. Holy shit. Michael's chair scraped back. I need to get a doctor. You're in there. You're actually in there. Panic shot through Daniel. Not yet. Caroline couldn't know. With a supreme effort, he moved his finger twice in rapid succession. No. Michael paused. No? You don't want a doctor? One twitch. Yes. I don't understand. You're conscious. This changes everything. We need to tell the medical team. Two twitches. No. Why not? Daniel, you're waking up. This is what we've been praying for. How would he explain? The code was too limited. Daniel tried a new approach, moving his finger in a pattern. 1, 2, 3, then a pause. 1, 2, 3. Are you counting? Michael asked, confusion evident in his voice. Two twitches. No. Daniel tried again, moving his finger in what he hoped resembled writing. Writing? You're trying to write something? One twitch. Yes. Okay. Michael's voice was excited now. Let me get something. I'll be right back. Daniel heard his brother rush from the room, returning moments later. How about a pen and paper? I'm going to put the pen in your hand. Just try to make any mark you can. The cool metal of a pen was pressed into Daniel's barely responsive hand. Michael wrapped his own hand around Daniel's, helping to position the pen against the paper. Just try, Michael encouraged. Any movement at all. Daniel summoned every ounce of his concentration, focusing on the sensation of the pen, trying to push it across the paper. His first attempts produced nothing, but Michael was patient, adjusting his grip, providing support without taking over completely. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, Daniel managed to produce a shaky, barely legible scrawl. C-A-R. Michael read slowly. Caroline? Is that what you're trying to write? One twitch. Yes. What about Caroline? With painful slowness, Daniel managed to scratch out more letters. D-I-N-G-U-R. Danger? Caroline is in danger. Michael sounded alarmed. Two twitches. No. Caroline is dangerous? Is that what you're saying? One twitch. Yes. I don't understand. How is Caroline dangerous? She's been here every day, fighting for you. P-L-A-N-K-P-L-M. There was a long silence. Daniel could hear his brother's breathing, quick and shallow. Daniel, that's a serious accusation. Are you sure? Could this be confusion from your brain injury? One emphatic twitch. Yes, he was sure. Tell me more. What plan? With excruciating effort, Daniel managed to convey the essentials. Caroline and Jason, their affair, their plan to have him declared permanently vegetative, their intention to sell the company. By the time he finished, his hand was cramping painfully, and exhaustion threatened to pull him back into unconsciousness. Jesus Christ, Michael whispered when Daniel had finished. I knew something was off with her, but this is beyond anything I imagined. His voice hardened. We need evidence. Your word against hers won't be enough, especially given your condition. No offense. None taken, Daniel thought grimly. He was all too aware of how he would appear, a brain-damaged husband making wild accusations against his devoted wife. Even his limited communication would be called into question. Was it really consciousness or just random nerve firings interpreted as meaningful by a desperate brother? Here's what we're going to do, Michael said, his voice low and intense. I'm not going to tell anyone you're conscious yet. Not the doctors, not Caroline, no one. I'll get a small recording device. Hide it in your room. If Caroline and Jason are having these conversations here, we'll catch them. In the meantime, I'll talk to the company lawyers, make sure the trust is locked down tight. And I'll delay this medical meeting somehow. Buy us more time. It was a solid plan, better than anything Daniel could have devised in his current state. Relief flooded through him. followed quickly by exhaustion. His finger twitched once in agreement. "You should rest now," Michael said, gathering the paper with Daniel's shaky writing. "I'll destroy this. No evidence until we're ready. I'll be back tomorrow with the recorder." He paused, then added in a choked voice, "I knew you were in there, Danny. I knew you wouldn't leave us." After Michael left, Daniel allowed himself to drift, not quite to sleep, but to a state of mental rest. For the first time since waking to Caroline's betrayal, he felt something like hope. But beneath that hope lurked fear. Fear that they wouldn't gather the evidence in time. Fear that Caroline would somehow discover their plan. Fear that his body would betray him before he could protect himself and his company. The next day passed in tense anticipation. Caroline visited briefly in the morning, speaking to him with the same false concern she always displayed in case medical staff were nearby, then making several business calls from his room. Daniel listened carefully, but she said nothing incriminating. She was too careful for that in a public setting. When Michael arrived that evening, he moved around the room with deliberate casualness, talking about mundane matters, the weather, a baseball game, office gossip. But Daniel understood the performance was for any potential listeners in the hallway. After a few minutes, Michael leaned close to Daniel's ear. "It's done," he whispered. "Recording device behind the TV. Voice activated. I've also spoken to our lawyer. The trust is secure. Caroline can't make any moves without unanimous approval from the trustees." One twitch. "Good. The medical meeting is still scheduled for Monday. I couldn't stop it without raising suspicions. So we have 4 days to get what we need." 4 days. It wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. The waiting was excruciating. Daniel maintained his comatose facade through nurse visits, doctor examinations, and Caroline's daily appearances. She seemed increasingly agitated, checking her watch frequently, making more calls. Whatever her timeline had been, it was clearly accelerating. On the third day, late in the afternoon, Caroline arrived with Jason in tow. Daniel's heart rate increased slightly, and he focused on controlling his breathing, afraid the monitors would betray him. "The room's clear?" Jason asked after the door closed. "Yes, I checked the schedule. No nurses due for at least an hour." Caroline sounded tense. "What's the problem?" "Your message sounded urgent. Michael's been to see the lawyers. He's locked down the trust, so I can't make any decisions without his approval." "Can he do that?" "Apparently. There's some clause about, in the event of disagreement between trustees, that requires court intervention. It could take months, even years, to resolve. So we're screwed." Jason sounded panicked. "No, we adjust the plan." Caroline's voice had a cold determination that sent a chill through Daniel. "We move directly to phase 2. No more waiting for the doctors to declare him permanently vegetative. We make it happen ourselves." "What are you talking about?" "There are ways to induce brain death that look natural in someone in his condition. A carefully calibrated air bubble in his fore. An insulin overdose. Untraceable if done correctly." "Jesus, Carolini." Jason's voice was shocked. "You're talking about murder. Actually killing him, not just letting nature take its course. Don't be naive. The end result is the same. This just accelerates the timeline." "I didn't sign up for this," Jason protested. "Affairs and inheritance schemes are one thing. Murder is something else entirely." "It's too late to develop a conscience now," Caroline snapped. "You're already an accessory. You think the police would believe you didn't know my intentions after all our recorded conversations about waiting for him to die?" "Recorded conversations?" Daniel's mind raced. Had Caroline and Jason been recording their own discussions as some kind of insurance policy against each other? "Are you threatening me?" Jason asked, voice low and dangerous. "I am stating facts. We're in this together now. All the way." Caroline's tone softened. "Look, it's one simple act. Quick and painless. He won't feel a thing. He's not even in there anymore. And then we're free. The money, the future we planned, all of it." A long silence followed. Daniel strained to hear any movement, any indication of what was happening. "When?" Jason finally asked, his voice resigned. "Tonight, after visiting hours. I'll tell the nurses I want to sit with him alone for a while. I've done it before. They won't question it. I know where they keep the insulin." It will look like his body simply gave up after weeks of trauma. And what do you need me to do? Create an alibi for me. Be seen somewhere public. Call me while you're there, so my phone pings off a different tower. Basic stuff. Phoenix. Jason sounded defeated. Call me when it's done. Don't look so tragic, Caroline said, a smile in her voice. This time tomorrow, we'll be millionaires in waiting. After they left, Daniel lay in a state of near panic. They were going to kill him. Tonight. The recording would be evidence of their crime, but it would come too late to save him. He needed to alert someone to protect himself, but how? His ability to communicate was still limited to finger movements, and only Michael knew to look for them. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Daniel worked frantically to increase his mobility. He managed to move his hand more deliberately, even raise his arm a few centimeters off the bed, but these small victories would not be enough to save his life. He needed to wake up fully, to call for help, to defend himself. The dinner hour came and went. Nurses checked on him, adjusted his recorded his vitals. Each time, Daniel tried to signal his distress, but the movements were too subtle, too easily dismissed as random nerve firings. The night shift arrived. Fewer staff, quieter hallways. The perfect conditions for Caroline's plan. Just after 9 o'clock, when the hospital had settled into its nighttime rhythm, the door to Daniel's room opened. Caroline's distinctive footsteps approached the bed. "Hello, darling," she said softly. "Special night tonight." Daniel heard the rustle of her purse, imagined her removing the stolen insulin and syringe. Panic surged through him, and with it, a desperate rush of adrenaline. Now or never. With every ounce of his remaining strength, Daniel forced his eyes open. The room was dimly lit, but after weeks of darkness, even this soft light was blinding. Caroline stood beside his bed, her back to him, arranging something on the small table. A syringe. A vial. Daniel tried to speak, but his throat was dry and unused, producing only a raspy croak. It was enough. Caroline whirled around, the syringe clutched in her hand. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, pure shock registered on her face. "Daniel," she whispered, "you're awake?" He managed a slight nod, never breaking eye contact. Her shock transformed rapidly. Confusion, calculation, then a warm smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh my God, this is amazing," she exclaimed, her voice artificially bright. "Let me call nurse." "You're back, you're finally back." She made no move toward the call button, instead stepping closer to the bed, the syringe still in her hand. "Such perfect timing," she said, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "I was just about to give you your medication. The nurses showed me how. To help you rest more comfortably." Daniel's eyes flicked meaningfully to the syringe, then back to her face. His expression must have conveyed his understanding, because her smile faltered. "How long have you been awake?" she asked, her voice hardening. Daniel remained silent, conserving his strength, watching her calculate the possibilities. "It doesn't matter," she decided. "No one would believe you anyway. Brain damage causes all sorts of confusion, delusions. The doctors will say you imagined things during your transition to consciousness." She raised the syringe, all pretense gone now. "This will still look natural. A setback after a brief improvement. Common in cases like yours." As she reached for his foreline, Daniel summoned his last reserves of strength. His arm shot up, catching her wrist. The movement was weak, uncoordinated, but it was enough to startle her. The syringe clattered to the floor. "Nurse," Daniel croaked, his voice barely audible. "Help!" "Shut up," Caroline hissed, clapping her hand over his mouth. "Just shut up and die, you stubborn bastard." Daniel bit down on her hand, hard enough to draw blood. Caroline yelped and jerked back, knocking into the monitoring equipment. Alarms began to sound, shrill, insistent beeping that cut through the hospital's quiet. "What's going on in here?" A nurse appeared in the doorway, flipping on the overhead lights. Caroline spun around, clutching her bleeding hand to her chest. He woke up," she stammered. "My husband woke up and attacked me." The nurse rushed to the bedside, quickly assessing Daniel's condition. "Mr. Mercer, can you hear me?" Yes, Daniel managed, his voice stronger now. My wife tried to kill me. Recording behind TV. He's confused, Caroline insisted. Disoriented. This can happen with brain injuries. The nurse looked skeptical, her eyes darting between Daniel's desperate face and Caroline's bleeding hand. I'm calling the doctor, she said, reaching for the phone. And security. That's not necessary, Caroline said quickly. I can handle this. He just needs to calm down. Ma'am, please step away from the patient, the nurse said firmly, her finger hovering over the call button. Caroline's composure cracked. With a sudden movement, she lunged for the fallen syringe. The nurse shouted for help as Caroline scrambled to retrieve the insulin. Before she could reach it, the door burst open again. 2 security guards and another nurse rushed in, taking in the chaotic scene. She tried to kill me, Daniel said again, each word a struggle, but clearer now. Recording device behind the television. Evidence. The next hours passed in a blur. Police were called. The recording device was found and its contents reviewed. Caroline was taken into custody, protesting her innocence even as the damning conversation with Jason played for the officers. Daniel was surrounded by medical personnel, undergoing evaluations, answering questions, proving his cognitive awareness despite his physical limitations. By morning, the story had spread throughout the hospital. Daniel Mercer, the medical device entrepreneur, had awakened from his coma just in time to prevent his wife from murdering him for his fortune. It was the kind of sensational tale that would dominate local news cycles for weeks, then resurface in true crime podcasts and television specials for years to come. Michael arrived as dawn broke, having been called by the police. The brothers' reunion was emotional, filled with relief and lingering fear. I should have been here, Michael said, gripping Daniel's hand tightly. If I'd known she'd move so quickly. You couldn't have known, Daniel reassured him, his voice still rough but strengthening with use. None of us knew how far she'd go. The doctors were amazed by Daniel's recovery. Though still weak and facing months of physical therapy, his cognitive functions were largely intact. A miracle, Dr. Levin called it, though Daniel knew better. It wasn't divine intervention, but human determination, the desperate will to survive, to protect what he'd built, to see justice done. In the weeks that followed, as Daniel slowly regained his strength, the full story emerged. Caroline and Jason had been involved for over a year. The car accident that had put Daniel in a coma had not been entirely accidental. The brake lines had been tampered with, though not enough to ensure death, a half measure that reflected Jason's ambivalence about murder. Caroline had been more decisive in her hospital plot, driving the plan forward when Jason wavered. Both were charged with attempted murder and conspiracy. Jason, facing the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence, agreed to testify against Caroline in exchange for leniency. His testimony, combined with the recorded conversation and Daniel's account, built an overwhelming case. Caroline maintained her innocence to the end, claiming Daniel had misinterpreted what he'd heard while semi-conscious, that the recording had been taken out of context, that she'd been manipulated by Jason. The jury didn't believe her. 6 months after waking from his coma, Daniel sat in a courtroom and watched as his wife of 15 years was sentenced to 20 years in prison for attempted murder. He felt no triumph, no vindication, only a profound sadness for what had been lost, for the woman he thought he'd known, for the life they might have had if ambition and resentment hadn't poisoned their relationship. The rebuilding process was slow and painful. Physical therapy restored most of Daniel's mobility, though he retained a slight limp and occasional tremors in his hands. The company had suffered during his absence, but with Michael's help and Diane's steady leadership, Mercer Biomedical regained its footing. The NeuroFlex line eventually received FDA approval, becoming the company's most successful product to date. Daniel found himself changed by his experience, more aware of his mortality, more appreciative of genuine connections, more attuned to the people around him. He restructured the company to allow for better work-life balance, not just for himself, but for all employees. He reconnected with old friends, made new ones, even began dating again after his divorce from Caroline was finalized. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, He would remember the sound of Caroline's voice as she plotted his death, the cold calculation in her eyes as she stood over his hospital bed with the syringe.